In the history of gaming, we've crossed different dimensions, everything in the 2D and 3D space. We've shaped and manipulated stories and settings for existing technology. I never really thought about it much when I was a kid, but as I dug deeper into the intricacies of game development as well as talking about other games, I've also developed interests in covering different aspects of gaming as a whole, or specific games that I've enjoyed, or a specific game. And so far, the journey on this channel has gone on for a lot longer than I expected, and I'm glad to have spent every second of it, as well as the games that I've discovered before this channel and after. From racing games to shooters, RPGs, strategies, simulations, and sandbox games. I've absorbed a lot of media, and the consistent consumption of said media has only given me more fuel for ideas to bring up in future videos as I become more knowledgeable on the subject. But today I'll be going into another specific subject in mind that's cropped up recently in my mind as I've started exploring some old classics from the 2000s. Here I'll be talking about 2D multiplayer shooters and how I feel about them. Historically, the ambition among game developers has always been towards developing the 3D space even more, with growing technology that can create more pixels showing better graphics, engines that render better physics and dynamic geometry on the map. The evolution of gaming is an endless one, and for some time now we're at a funny stage where there's a lot of developers going the opposite direction instead of going forward, making more retro-inspired games that are a rejection of the entire modern mainstream gaming scene. Back in the 2000s, there was a general preference for indie devs to work on 2D games, rather than 3D that is, and to an extent it still remains a thing. 3D game dev is very difficult, even more so than 2D. Even for teams with hundreds of people making games like GTA 5 or Doom Eternal. You can have one person or a handful of people make a 2D game and it will come out much quicker because of the lack of worry regarding depth, angles, and 3D perception, not to mention modeling. 2D in general has always had the advantage of being able to rapidly make assets quicker because of how much different it is to not only make the sprite in 3D, scratch that, to make the model in 3D, not the sprite. The sprite is 2D, but the model's 3D. But to also bake the model and render existing models, UV wrapping them with 2D sprites correctly and then learning how to rig the 3D models so that they animate. In 2D, it's as simple as copying over the same frame with variations that give off the illusions of an animation. 2D shooters are a dime a dozen, whether they're top-down like Hotline Miami or side-viewed like a 2D platformer. But when it comes to 2D multiplayer shooters, there's something that you don't hear about as much because of the existing 3D scene, as well as the most popular multiplayer shooters being 3D anyways, 3D tech being the thing that modern gamers want. In the 2D space, you still have options, from co-op based games, twin stick or top-down shooters, both in single player or multiplayer. These games though, Soldat and CS2D, are part of the old vanguard of freeware gaming from the 2000s. They've been around since forever, and CS2D, like CS Source, will be 20 years old next year. I grew up with lots of games like this on the PC. Games that were easy to pick up and play on the browser, but were hard to master. Easy to get into, but like I said, hard to master. Intense and fun, and didn't ask for a single buck. The idea of it being free was a blessing for the kid like me, and while they still hold up today, especially since the indie 2D scene is littered with so many 2D shooters, these games still have a dedicated community and they're both moddable and even allow for map making too. A criminally underrated tool that not enough people appreciate. There are people out there that generally prefer 2D over 3D, and there are some reasons as to the why most likely. For starters, the side or top-down perspective gives you a flat perspective and everyone has the same level of visibility between each other. In Soldat or CS2D, you can't necessarily look all the way, but you can see who's around the corner as well as your overall surroundings, unless you have Fog of War on. Controls are usually very tight and simple, in some cases even tighter and more simple than most 3D games, which means a lot of people can pick it up. In the case of developers, they are much easier to make. Graphically, they don't ask too much out of the person or the computer. There are a great range of art styles that can not only fit into the experience, but won't necessarily tank your PC either, like a lot of 3D games nowadays do. Sure, there are some amazing looking 2D games like the Ori games, but a majority of them are either pixel based or the older ones have something that you would see in a Flash game. The 2D shooter games like Soldat, CS2D, and even T-World was so easy to run that even the school computers in the library back then could run it, not to mention the lack of space that they would occupy, whereas you see 3D games nowadays, 100 gigs is the minimum, which is ridiculous. Levels can be developed much quicker. In fact, most people can easily make a map in something like Soldat or CS2D since they come in with a built-in editor. Sure, it takes some time to navigate, but some of the best maps ever made were made by people that didn't initially think that they could do it. Gameplay in general is simpler to go for. There are a lot of other factors in 3D games like scaling objects with depth. Objects and levels are easier to perceive because you're only worrying about the size rather than the real life size, scaling, a perception that you have to consider in 3D gaming. Cost is cheap, not cheap like a can of Coke, but cheaper than your usual 3D projects that have people that put time and resources to getting components together. And in these 2D shooters, the talent really shows, with some of these games even being made by one person, like CS2D for instance. Now when it comes to skill, it's something that's a little jarring at first. A 2D game is always going to feel different, and skills that are unique to 3D games aren't necessarily going to transfer over here. Even if you're really good at CS, it's not going to automatically make you better at, say, CS2D, which admittedly is an easier game technically speaking. But because of the fundamental differences between each other, there are other unique aspects of 2D gaming that you have to think about. The only commonalities that these two versions of CS have is the fact that they're both in the same setting and that they're also both shooters. But the biggest difference is obviously the way the camera is placed as well as the dimensions. One has the extra dimension of depth and the other doesn't. CS2D's top-down space dials down the depth and you just have the flat view from a bird's view. You have to watch for both your character and your mouse too. Whereas in 3D games, you just have to worry about what's around or in front of you. But what makes it easier is the fact that you can see almost everything with a wider berth. Same goes for Soldat and its sequel game Soldat 2, where you always have information to what's going on. And when it comes to shooting, aiming's a bit weird because it's more about the general direction and position of your character, not just your mouse. In 3D, you just need a clear shot and your crosshair on the dot. Position is something that you have factored in, right? Well, in 2D, you're literally seeing where your character is and you have to look at where your character is too. In 2D, you rely also more on timing and precise direction, like I said, for both your character and the mouse placement, as well as the awareness of, your surroundings, which you can see on pretty much almost the entire map. Both types of games are hard, but for different reasons, and being good at one doesn't necessarily make you better at the other. Or say, if you're really good at CS and you go to Soldat, again, completely different games, apples and oranges. I'm fairly competent in FPS games, but that doesn't mean shit when I started up these games. It's like adapting to a new genre, and it still takes practice even if you have the general idea of it. In saying all this though, people have moved on to 3D and for good reason, and I'm not trying to suggest that 2D is somehow better. I don't think it is. It lacks the versatility that the 3D space can provide. But 2D does provide simplicity, which is like the opposite of versatility. But don't get me wrong, 2D games can still have versatility, it's just in a limited scope compared to 3D. 2D games are still fun, they are tight and can also be addictive. 2D multiplayer shooters benefit from the simplicity, from its graphics to gameplay, and most importantly, its controls. Keyboard and mouse controller, these shooters can apply for both types of players. If you're shit with mouse and keyboard, that's completely fine. You can still do just as well with the controller. There are some amazing 2D shooters that I haven't even mentioned, and for those that remember Soldat, the sequel is on Steam, while still in early access, is still ongoing, is still getting updated, also has a Discord community that you can join that organizes matches. I'll provide links for both Soldat games and a few other games, including CS2D, in the description. These are the type of multiplayer shooters that have a pick up and play approach to it that's unique compared to other simple 3D shooters. And you can have simple and complex games in the 2D dimension. Fighting games have some pretty in-depth mechanics in gameplay, and the most popular ones are either 2D or 2.5D based, which is a bridge between 2D and 3D. 2D platformers are great, and so is the shooter scene within that space. 2D can be just as addicting. It's been 5 to 6 days and I've already clocked in over 70 hours in Cookie Clicker. And there are people that have spent thousands, even over 20,000 hours in games like CS2D. Games that are simple to get into, have tons of customization, and almost any PC can run them because they're not as graphically intensive. Not even the newest ones in the 2D scene. As I've already said, there are a metric ton of 2D shooters on the market, but the multiplayer side of it is something I don't really hear much about, and it's disappointing because there are some really solid games here. And CS2D and Soldat are still going strong as a game that have dedicated communities that have been around for a very long time. I look forward to any fun multiplayer experience and try to keep an open mind, and seeing more 2D multiplayer shooters is something I'm also open to seeing. Definitely check the scene out. Check out some of the old classics as well as the ones that are available today. Thank you for watching.